Thank you, Anita. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Make UK and this session regarding UKCA and CA labelling. Delighted you could join us this afternoon for this very important topic. It's a topic we have we are returning to again after dealing with it for a couple of times over previous sessions in the course of the last couple of years. It is an important issue for UK manufacturing, particularly with regard to knowingly being able to put your product legally on the market, both here in the UK, in Great Britain and in Northern Ireland, and also in terms of what you need to do for product labelling requirements going into the EU as well. You'll be aware that there have been a number of changes to the application of UKCA labelling over the course of the last couple of years since the UK formally left the EU at the start of the decade. And in November 2022, businesses were given additional flexibility to apply these new product labelling requirements with the addition of a further extension period in time. We're joined here today by three colleagues from government who will help demystify some of the changes that have taken place and help you understand what's required. Leading us today will be Emily Spearpoint-Walsh. She is the UKCA engagement lead at the Department of Business and Trade. She'll be supported by Emily Preston, who is part of the UKCA policy team in the same department as well. They'll cover off some presentations for the first 20 minutes or so. Included here today, we also have Rahina Haned, who is part of or is in the construction product policy team at the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And quite clearly, for those of you in the construction and building product sector, the implications of the change for UKCA is important for you. We'll go through the changes and it affects that particular product category and class at the end of the presentation from Emily as well. So the format is we'll have some presentations to start with, and then there'll be a Q&A session that will follow. Annette said she will just do a quick sample poll now just to get some context for us to understand where you are in your understanding relating to UKCA and CE labelling requirements. My colleague Fergus, who you can see on the call here, will then take over the Q&A session from about 12:30 or so, and will conclude the session for us this afternoon. So delighted that we have a good number of members joining us this afternoon. The poll is now on your screen. Please complete that as quickly as possible, and then we'll formally launch into the presentations. Thanks very much indeed.
So there are 5 questions in total. So if you answer these and then scroll down.
We'll just give you a few more moments just to complete the questions. And it will indicate when we have a fair response to those.
Apologies for the untitled question, I've just noticed. Just tick anything on that one. Must have been an error when compiling it.
Right, can I suggest we make a start on the presentations while people just finish off completing the survey. We'll come back to the results of that after the presentation session. Emily, can I hand over to you just for you to give a run through of the headline of the changes which were announced in November, what businesses should be preparing for now, particularly as it affects those in the manufacturing and engineering sector. Emily, over to you.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen for you before I make a start. Great, I should be sharing now.
Emily, you're on mute, I think.
No?
We can't hear you at the moment. At least I
think
can't
that
hear you,
might
Emily.
just be yourself, Richard. The others are not.
I can hear everything fine. That's absolutely perfect.
Okay. Fingers crossed participants can hear. Please do pop in the chat or Q&A if you can't hear me. So I'll make a start. Thank you all for coming to this session. Really pleased to be here and present to you about the updates on UKCA. So as mentioned before, I'm head of engagement currently on UKCA, and my colleague Rachel is also on the call, and she works in the policy team, and she'll be helping me at the Q&A later on. So let's make a start. So I'll be providing a bit of an overview of UKCA process, including, as Richard mentioned, the November update, a bit about what is the UKCA marking. I think a lot of you will be pretty familiar with UKCA by now, so I won't go into too much detail on it, but obviously if anything's unclear or if you'd like more guidance on any particular parts, then we can cover that in the Q&A later on. But I am going to cover some areas where we've published some further guidance for you, so we'll be covering that afterwards. And then finally, we'll talk about the UKCA roundtables that have just been launched, and I'll be able to share the invite for you all for that if anyone would like to attend. Just to note, we can't cover every situation in the time allowed, and we can't give you advice about individual circumstances, but we will do our best to point you in the direction of the guidance that you need to help you with your query. So to start off with, the UKCA mark applies to most goods which previously required the CE marking and reversed epsilon marking. It's the product marking for the market in Great Britain, so England, Scotland and Wales. As part of new ministers' commitment to reduce burdens for industry, in November 2022, the government used its regulatory autonomy to provide businesses with the freedom to choose to use either the CE or the UKCA marking for goods placed on the GB market. The government has introduced legislation to extend the deadline for recognising the CE marking and reversed epsilon marking for goods placed on the GB market or put into service until 31st of December 2024. Additionally, to further support businesses who have already started using the UKCA marking, we have brought forward legislation to extend the labelling and the retesting measures announced in June 2022 to reflect the continued recognition of CE marking until the 31st of December 2024. There are different rules for medical devices, construction products, cableways, transportable pressure equipment, unmanned aircraft systems, rail products and marine equipment. And that's because these areas don't fall under the Department for Business and Trade sectors. But as mentioned before, we have a colleague here from DLUC who'll be able to cover construction products after this presentation. So, as mentioned, we're making it as easy as possible for businesses who choose to use the UKCA marking going forwards by reducing retesting costs and extending that labelling easement that was announced in June 2022. First, we introduced legislation to amend the deadline for allowing conformity assessment activities for CE marking to be used by manufacturers or other relevant persons as the basis for UKCA marking. Manufacturers or other relevant persons will be able to use conformity assessment activities for CE marking undertaken by the 31st of December 2024 as a basis for UKCA marking to reduce duplication and retesting costs for businesses. As previously, the good must still meet all UKCA requirements, including the UKCA marking, and will need to undergo conformity assessment with a UK-approved body when the testing certificate expires, or before the 31st of December 2027, whichever is sooner. Where manufacturers are using existing CE certification completed before the 31st of December 2024, we would encourage you to include in the UK Declaration of Conformity the list of relevant UK designated standards and equivalent EU harmonised standards that apply to the product, and the details of the EU CAB which carried out the conformity assessment procedures. This easement will reduce duplication and costs for businesses and, by extension, consumers. Secondly, we will be reducing labelling costs by continuing to allow businesses to affix the UKCA marking and to include importer information from products from EEA countries, and in some cases Switzerland, on an accompanying document or a label until the 31st of December 2027. As before, if you are placing the UKCA marking on an accompanying document, it is important it reaches its end user to indicate that the good is compliant. In the case of a single batch moving through the supply chain, each individual good is not required to have an accompanying document. But if a batch was broken up, each batch would need their own accompanying document, and so on as it moves through the supply chain to its end user. The legislation may continue to allow the use of accompanying documents for some products after the end of the easement date, and so we strongly recommend checking the legislation which applies to your particular product to see if this applies to you. So, as mentioned, the UKCA marking applies to all goods which previously required the CE marking and reversed epsilon marking. So there's some kind of information on the map here on the screen which you should all be familiar with, but it's a useful way of setting out where the UKCA marking applies. And then I'll just kind of briefly go through this to move on to the kind of new guidance, as you should all be fairly familiar with this already. But as I've said, any more clarity that's needed, we can cover it in the Q&A. So this is a list of product areas covered by the UKCA marking. It includes measuring instruments, radio equipment, eco designs. And please note there are some special rules in place, and that's in that box over on the right there. If your product does not fall under any of these product areas and you're unable to find specific legislation relevant to your product in the A to Z of industry guidance, we would advise you to check the General Product Safety Regulations page, as well as speak to your trade association or seek legal advice to ensure your good is compliant when placed on the market in Great Britain. This slide summarises the process you'll need to follow to get the UKCA marking onto your goods and onto the GB market. Once you've established you need the UKCA marking, you need to check the route for conformity assessment, so whether you can self-declare or need to have your product tested. As we've mentioned, this is generally the same as for the CE marking. You must then get your product tested or follow the procedures for self-declaration, including keeping relevant documentation. You then need to apply the UKCA marking to your product. Once you follow the appropriate procedures and place the UKCA marking on your product, you can then place it onto the market. So in this slide, we'll look at how to affix the UKCA marking onto your product, including a reminder of the labelling easement we had put in place as part of our transitional measures to help businesses adapt in the new UK regulatory regime. So this labelling easement, as we mentioned, allows for the UKCA marking to be placed on the product until the 31st of December 2027 using either a sticky label or on an accompanying document. As we said, if it's on an accompanying document, it's important that each batch of products includes the accompanying documentation until it reaches its end user to show compliancy throughout the supply chain. For the general rules, firstly, the UKCA marking must be affixed visibly, legibly, and indelibly to the product. And you are able to place the UKCA marking alongside other markings, such as the CE marking, as long as the legibility and visibility of the UKCA mark isn't reduced. We now have some further guidance that hasn't been in our previous presentations that may be useful for you. So if you're a distributor, you are responsible for ensuring the products are compliant at the point at which they are placed on the GB market. You should not make a good available on the market if you have a reason to believe the good is not compliant. Fulfillment service providers provide services to other economic operators. They store products, and further to the receipt of orders, they package the products and ship them to consumers. For the GB market, any business using fulfillment service providers must speak to the UK Local Authority Trading Standards to understand their obligations. The Office for Product Safety and Standards are currently conducting a review of the UK Product Safety Framework to ensure it remains robust and is future-proof so that it continues to protect consumers while enabling businesses to safely innovate and grow. We also have some further guidance on authorised representatives. So the responsibilities of authorised representatives can vary significantly and may depend on specific product requirements, as well as what agreements they have made with manufacturers that require the use of an authorised representative to export goods to the EU. It is important to note that in most cases, authorised representatives are voluntary. We would really encourage you to check the specific product guidance on gov.uk, as it may be mandatory with certain product areas. As an authorised representative, your responsibilities may include drawing up a UK declaration of conformity, affixing the relevant marking, such as the UKCA marking, keeping technical documentation, and cooperating with UK market surveillance authorities when requested. If an authorised representative is also an importer or a distributor, they will need to fulfil the obligations of these economic operators under the legislation as well. New authorised representatives need to be based in the UK to be recognised under UK law. Please also note that for the EU market, approved representatives from the United Kingdom are not recognised. EU approved representatives must therefore be in one of the EU's 27 member states or Northern Ireland. Placing your product on the market. So this is something we've had a few queries on recently, so I'll just go over it briefly before moving on to our final section. So the key concept of placing goods on the market. Placing a good on the market refers to when an individual manufactured good is first made available for distribution, consumption or use on the GB market in the course of commercial activity. This refers to each individual good, not a type of good. To prove you have placed a product on the market, you can use documents normally used in business transactions. This includes an invoice or a contract of sale. We then have the different definition for putting into service, which is in the supply of machinery safety regulations. And this takes place the first time a good is used in GB by the end user for its intended purpose. If the legislation uses both terms, placing on the market and putting into service, UKCA marking requirements must be met before the first of these two happens. We also have a bit of further guidance on components. So all imported goods, including components, need to be compliant with UKCA requirements before being placed on the market, if they are placed on the market after the 31st of December 2024. This may include a requirement for components to be individually conformity assessed. If a GB importer brings components for assembly into a final good and marketed under their own name, the importer assumes the responsibilities of a manufacturer and must ensure UKCA compliance before making the completed good available on the GB market. Completed machinery will need to be UKCA marked when placed on the market or put into service. For machinery that is partly completed, you do not need the UKCA mark if it is only covered by the supply of machinery safety regulations. And finally, we have a couple of slides on prototypes. We've had some questions about this recently. So just to clarify, prototypes which are not yet made available for distribution, consumption or use on the GB market do not require UKCA marking, but it must only be displayed or operated under controlled conditions such as trade fairs, exhibitions or demonstrations in GB, and it must be operated by experts with restricted public contact, indicating it does not meet GB requirements and is not for supply. Goods undergoing testing and validating pre-production of units do not require UKCA marking, as they are still considered to be in the manufacturing stage. After 31st of December 2024, fully manufactured goods intended for consumer testing need to meet the UK requirements as they apply in GB, including being UKCA marked. And finally, on leasing and hiring, which is another area we've had some questions. So the loan, hire or leasing of a good supposes a transfer of possession or property rights concerning the good after the stage of manufacture is complete. For goods that are loaned, hired or leased, you will need UKCA marking if they are being placed on the GB market for the first time after the 31st of December 2024. However, repeated leasing and hiring of the same good, i.e. not just an identical good, which has been placed on the GB market before the 31st of December 2024 will not require remarking if loaned, leased or hired after this date. Before every leasing, the person leasing the good will need to check that the requirements are met. For example, a piece of equipment originating from the EU or another country outside the UK that is hired by a GB customer before the 31st of December 2024, bearing the CE marking, can be shipped back to the supplier and rehired later without the equipment needing to bear the UKCA marking. And the final topic that I'd like to quickly cover before we move on to the update from DLUC is our roundtables. So in exciting news, our team is hosting some industry roundtables during April and May. So these invites have been shared around, and I'm going to post a link into the chat or the Q&A, whichever will reach you in a moment. But the Department for Business and Trade are hosting a series of roundtables with stakeholders from a wide range of sectors. And we're using these to help us understand how we can make the UK's approach to product marking as easy as possible for industry, while ensuring we continue to protect customers. Our London roundtables have pretty quickly filled up, so we've not got too many spaces left there, but we still have some spaces left for Edinburgh particularly, and some in Manchester as well. So we're only going to be engaging on Department for Business and Trade sectors, and you'll be able to see that in the link that I will share in a moment. So you'll have the options there for each location, and you can sign up to whichever sector is most relevant to you, or a couple if you cover a couple of different sectors. And we'll really be using these roundtables as a listening exercise to gather feedback from industry, and we'd really welcome a range of stakeholders to be there. So I'll stop sharing my screen, but I think these slides will be able to be shared afterwards, and they have some kind of further links on them in terms of next steps, our contact details for getting in touch with us, and some more links for further reference here. So I'll stop sharing now and come back to the webinar. There we go. Thank you so much for listening.
Emily, thank you very much for that comprehensive overview. And yes, we'd be delighted if it was possible to share those slides with participants after the webinar. As you said, there's some excellent links to guidance which Make UK have worked with government colleagues to bring forward industry-friendly guidance on these issues as well. So delighted to see links to that. I'll come in a moment to Rohini Anand for an update from DLUC on particularly the construction products area, because the legislative cycle and the introduction of UKCA for construction products is slightly different in terms of timetable and operation. So very important for us just to separate these two conversations out. I can see there's already some questions coming in on the Q&A. Keep those coming. We'll come back to those after Rohini's presentation. Rohini, are you there with us?
I am having some problems with my camera. I'm not sure if you're able to see me at all, but hopefully you can hear me. Sorry about that.
No problem at all. We can't see you, unfortunately, but we can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, okay. Apologies. I will try and get that fixed as soon as possible. But thank you for inviting me along today. It's great to be with you all. I definitely echo Emily's message that we need to link up with our stakeholders as much as we possibly can. I know that DLUC is also planning on having some consultative roundtables, and we will welcome engagement as we consider reforms to the construction product sector. So this Q&A will be incredibly useful. Just want to echo Emily's point as well that unfortunately I am unable to answer specific questions on individual construction products and scenarios, but I will certainly try my best to point you in the right direction of people that you can contact, and I will share my contact details as well if anyone would like to get in touch after the session. So just to provide an update on the labelling requirements for construction products, Fergus is right that the legislative framework and timelines are slightly different. They don't differ too much from DBT, but definitely worth pointing out what the differences are. So we have extended the recognition of CE marked construction products for a further 2.5 years. So that will be until the 30th of June 2025. So until the 30th of June 2025, in Great Britain, England, Scotland and Wales, both the UK and CE mark will be continue to be recognised. Northern Ireland will continue to align with the requirements of the European Union's regulatory regime, and that will be under the terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol. One of the key questions which we get asked from stakeholders is how this announcement with extending the recognition of the CE mark links in with the announcement that DLUC made earlier in the year in June 2022. So I just think it's worth providing a few lines on that to clarify any confusion. So in June 2022, DLUC announced an intention to allow manufacturers of construction products under what's known as AVCP System 3, a type of testing system, whose products are tested by an EU notified body before the 1st of January 2023, and enabled them to obtain a UKCA mark without actually having to go through the process of retesting through a UK approved body. In line of the announcement that's just been made in December, this measure is no longer going to be introduced. So manufacturers with existing type tests that have already been carried out by an EU notified body can continue to use the CE mark. And also in recognition that legislation has actually not been introduced to cover this issue, OPSS will not take any enforcement action against any economic actor where a UK mark has been used on construction products. And this will be where the product's been fixed on a product that's been tested by a EU notified recognised body, where this testing was done before the 31st of December 2022. I will send around some links to this guidance so you've got it. I know it's useful to sometimes just have it on a written format, so I will make sure that you will have that to hand. It's probably just worth pointing out why there's a difference compared to DBT's timelines. So we feel that an extra 2.5 years and that additional 6 months will give us some time to engage closely with the industry, because we want to make further reforms to the construction product sector whilst also strengthening and enhancing the existing regulatory regime that we already have. So that will give us some more time to do that and hopefully have some interesting conversations with you all about how we might take this work forwards. It's just also worth pointing out the next steps that you'll need to take as a manufacturer if you aren't aware of this guidance already. So as I pointed out, this is an extension to the current situation. Manufacturers who are supplying their construction products on the Great British market can continue to either affix the UK or the CE mark to their products. And as I've said, the recognition of the CE mark will end on the 30th of June 2025. Where manufacturers do affix the UK mark to their products, they will need to use a UK recognised body. So that'll be a body that's geographically based in the UK and is approved. And I will link some further guidance as well. In terms of the labelling requirements for construction products, this remains the same. The regulation requires that a manufacturer must affix the UK or CE mark to their product, and where it's not possible for the mark to be affixed directly onto the construction product itself, the mark will be required to be affixed to either the product's packaging or to accompanying documentation. And one of the questions that we also get asked is, will I as a manufacturer selling to the EU need to test products twice to also sell on the GB market? And the answer to that is no. In Great Britain, manufacturers can supply products to the market where they meet all relevant requirements and are fixed with either the UK mark or the CE mark. The EU have indicated that they will only recognise the CE mark. We also advise you to, as well as asking us with any questions that you have in terms of specific questions about your construction product, to also make sure that you're talking to lawyers or anyone relevant to make sure that you are following the appropriate and specific rules in relation to your construction product specifically. And one of the key things that we're kind of sharing publicly is that we do want to engage and work closely with the industry to consider reforms to the construction products regulatory regime. So we will welcome any feedback or any questions that you might have. So thank you for that. It's worth just me finishing off by saying that some businesses have already adapted to the new UKCA marking regime, and we do just want to thank every business that has done that. We do think that complying with these measures as early as possible will help to make the transition as smooth as possible in the long term. And as I said, we will be engaging with you all closely as we go forward with this regulatory regime reform work. So thank you.
Rohini, thank you very much for that update, and I think it's very important for us to recognise that there are some slight differences when it comes to construction products. So thank you very much for going through that and highlighting the slightly different timetable. Please do continue to submit your questions to the Q&A function. I see that we've had a good number of questions come through already. What we're going to do is we're going to try and group those questions together so that we sort of take them in categories, looking at perhaps the overall policy priorities and agenda, looking more specifically at the labelling requirements and the changes which have been announced. And also pick up on some of the other related topics which perhaps aren't specifically related to UKCA but are linked. I will at this opportunity just take a question which came into us before the session. We had asked if any participants had questions before, and one was sent in. It was specifically in relation to the EU responsible individual. And just to make it very clear that the changes of the UK government to the introduction of the UKCA requirements have no change and will not change any responsibilities under the EU scheme. When the UK left the transition period on the 1st of February 2020, we became, 1st of January 2021, we became a third country, and therefore we would be complying and have to comply as a third country with all EU regulatory requirements for placing on the market. Those have not changed and will not change. So any changes to UK system do not change your obligations in the EU market. You will still have to have an EU registered address on your products. You will have to have an EU responsible contact for any product category that has that as a requirement, particularly if you are identified as exporters, importers, or distributors. So just to make that clear, no changes from our perspective to the EU responsibilities. This is specifically about placing goods on the GB market and not placing goods on the EU market. Emily, if I can come to you and start with the first set of questions. I think there's an overall question regarding the deferral of the deadline, which we have welcomed, and indeed a number of participants on the call or on the webinar have already highlighted that they have welcomed that deferral of the deadline. But there's a question about alignment with current EU standards, particularly for those goods where we will continue to recognise the CE. Is it likely that we're going to see further deviation between those two sets of legislation, and how are we going to manage that if we continue to accept CE mark goods where the EU regulations for that good may have changed vis-a-vis the UK requirements?
Hi there. Yes, brilliant question. So first off, I'd start on saying unfortunately, we're not able to make any comments on what may happen in the future, but government are continually monitoring any divergence between EU and UK regulations and will continue to do so. What I would say, though, is we are really interested in hearing industry's views on this, what their preferences would be in the longer term. You know, we want to hear how this would affect businesses. This is what these roundtables are here for, is for us to have a listening exercise on all issues relating to UKCA, and we're aware that divergence is tied in with that. So all I would say is, you know, at the moment I can't comment on it, but I would encourage this participant to come to the roundtables or share this with their network to come to the roundtables if possible, and we'd be absolutely happy to hear views on this and how it would affect your kind of sector and your business. So I hope that's at least a little helpful.
Emily, thank you very much for that. And just a note to participants, If we don't get through all of the questions in the time left, we have discussed with Emily and colleagues that we will endeavour to get back written answers to questions where we have those readily available. So if we don't get to your question, rest assured we will be happy to come back to it. Emily, a related question to the one which I started with in terms of obligations coming into market for foreign suppliers. The question is, if we are purchasing manufacturing equipment for overseas, is it correct to assume that we would need to make sure our overseas supplier is compliant with UKCA rather than CE marking? If you could take that question, thanks.
Yeah, Rach, are you happy to take this on, or we'll keep kind of swapping between me and Rach so neither of us lose our voice? So I think this question, right, is about if they're getting a good, placing it on the GB market, do they need the UKCA marking essentially, and when?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. So the requirements for UKCA marking mirror those that currently exist for CE. So both the manufacturer and the importer have obligations under the regulations which must be adhered to. So for example, the manufacturer must complete the conformity assessment procedure and affix the UKCA marking, and the importer must check that the goods are compliant before placing them on the market. In essence, importers will need to ensure that the goods that they're placing on the GB market after the 31st of December 2024 are lawfully UKCA marked. I hope that answers that question. Emily, if there's anything else that you want to come in on, please do.
No, that sounds good to me. The only thing I would add is just that easement I mentioned in the presentation about being able to use CE testing for UKCA marking. So the dates for that are, if you've tested it up until 31st of December 2024 for CE, you still need to affix that UKCA marking post 31st of December 2024. That can sometimes be an area of confusion. So after 31st of December 2024, the good will still need the UKCA marking on it, but you can demonstrate conformity by using CE certificate that's been done up to 31st of December 2024. And those conformity assessment activities can be used as the basis for UKCA marking until the expiry of the certificate or until the 31st of December 2027, whichever is sooner. So that's to avoid some of the kind of duplicative retesting costs that we were hearing about. So that's always a good, useful one to clear up, because people sometimes have confusion about how they can use the easement and whether they still need to actually use that UKCA marking on their good.
Emily and Rachel, thank you very much for that. Coming to another question regarding partially completed machinery. There was a question, was it correct that partially completed machinery does not need a UKCA marking? It wasn't clear in the slides if that was correct.
Yes, absolutely. Let me just find the slide again for that. So this kind of sits with our OPSS colleagues, so we can always follow up with this afterwards. I found it here. So essentially, for machinery that's partly completed, you don't need the UKCA mark if it is only covered by the supply of machinery safety regulations. So that's one I've got, but if that participant wants to come back with a question, we can go to our colleagues at OPSS. Unfortunately, my colleague who deals with machinery had other things today, though, super busy at the moment, but they said that any questions relating to machinery, we can pass it to them and they'll get a response to you as soon as possible, so we can follow up on that.
Emily, thank you very much for that, and we will follow up to see if there are any more detailed points on that question. I'll come to a last one in the sort of round of questions on UKCA general policy, and then Rahini, there are some questions on construction products which I might just run past you, and I again recognise that you may not be able to answer them all today, but I'll give you a couple just to see if it's possible. The first one is the person who submitted the question has suggested that it's a daft question. I think very much the opposite. I think it's a very sensible question, and I think it's at the core of perhaps why we are running these sorts of webinars, and well, the government is keen also to do so. But if you're going to be selling a product in the EU and internationally, as well as in the UK, if the UK is continuing to recognise CE marking as being acceptable and as equivalent to the UKCA mark, what is the point in getting UKCA accreditation? And I think it isn't a daft question. I think it is a genuinely important question, because I think this is exactly at the core of why we need to raise awareness on this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I can take this one. So essentially, I'd summarize this question as, what is the point of UKCA marking? Why are we putting it into place? And what I would say is, so we explained in this presentation about how there's been these easements and this kind of extending the deadlines for CE marking and recognition, which has been put in place as a transitional easement to help businesses. Particularly, we published this back in November, this announcement of the 2-year extension, really within a context of kind of challenging circumstances for industry with rising costs and kind of supply chain risks. What I would say is the UKCA regime means that in the long term, we do have control over our product regulations, and we can use that autonomy to choose how we regulate. And the reason we're doing these roundtables is to be able to listen to industry on how to best manage that transition. So apologies for keeping plugging the roundtables, but we really would encourage you to come to us to kind of share your views on this. But yeah, as I say, UKCA regime means that we have control over our product regulations. But the reason we've extended this CE recognition is to basically give businesses the time that they need to prepare. And we were having a lot of engagements last year, really listening to industry and understanding their challenges. And that is why we put these easements and this extension into place. So I hope that helps answer that question.
If I could just actually follow up from Emily, just to talk a bit about construction products, because there is definitely a link there. So as you'll be aware, the original intention was to end recognition of the CE mark in December of 2022, and obviously that's now been extended. Just following on from Emily, we also had many conversations with stakeholders and paid close attention to the written correspondence which we received as well, which outlined manufacturers' concerns about the costs involved in adapting to the new UK marking regime, and some of the concerns they had with the timelines. So we also made this decision because we want to support industry as much as possible. This reflects efforts across government to reduce regulatory burdens for businesses. It's also intended to prevent any immediate cost increases and burdens for businesses, which in the case of construction products and perhaps for other product sectors more generally would be passed on to consumers and commercial supply chains. And at the heart of all of this is obviously the focus on maintaining high standards of product safety. So I would just echo that that's definitely not a silly question in terms of the divergence between UKCA and CE marking, but the intention is for this extension to end on the 30th of June 2025 for construction products. Adapting to the new UKCA marking regime now will help to make this transition smoother in the long term, and we'd like to thank anyone that may already have complied with this transition.
Rohini, thank you very much for that. And that brings us actually neatly on to a few questions on construction products. I'll start with 2 questions, if I can take them together, because I think they're quite well related. Construction products holding a UKCA mark based on an EU notified body's testing, do these have to be completely sold through the system by that 30th of June 2025 date? And related to that, if that is the case, what happens after 2025 if there is no UK approved body capable of certifying a good, or there isn't a sufficient capacity in the market to be able to do that? If you could just take those 2 questions, that'd be great.
Sure. No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you for asking those questions, and I think they do link very well together. So one of the concerns that we are aware of is capacity within the UK approved body. It's one that we've been told many times, we see it ourselves. And I mentioned that we are using this extension period to consider reforms for the construction product sector, and that will involve close conversations with UK approved bodies. It will involve thinking about how UK approved bodies can work together. Unfortunately, I can't that I can't speak too much about what can happen in the future post 2025, but that is a concern that we are definitely aware of. It's also been brought to our attention by UK approved bodies themselves. And as I've noted before, we also want to hold engagement with stakeholders. And so if you have any more specific questions about that, then we could consider the possibility of having direct conversations with UK approved bodies and stakeholders, but definitely noted. So thank you for raising that. And in terms of UK approved bodies and affixing your UKCA mark, if you want to affix, at the moment there is the choice between affixing CE marking to your product and also UKCA marking to your product. If you do want to have that UKCA marking affixed to your product, you do need to go through the process of getting this done with the UK approved body. There's been some confusion as to whether or not the approved body needs to be geographically based in the UK, or whether there's opportunities for subcontracting. This UK approved body will need to be geographically based in the UK. So I hope that clears up any confusion, but definitely note the concerns around capacity and capability, and that is one of the key reforms that we will be addressing in time, and hope to be able to share some more information with you when I can.
Really, thank you very much for that. The other questions, particularly on construction products, are more related to roundtables, and I'm sure when you have dates and information on that, we will be very happy to circulate that around our membership and the participants on this call as well. Before perhaps I come back to Emily and Rachel on some labelling type questions, just to highlight a few of the questions which have come in the Q&A, which we won't, I suspect, be able to come to on the call today. There's a question about reach for products placed on the market. I anticipate that will be a different team who are working on the rollout of UK reach, but we're very happy to share that with colleagues in that team to give some further guidance. There's also a question on requirements for the cross-bin labelling mark for the WEEE directive, the Waste Electronics and Electrical Equipment Directive. Emily, not sure if you're able to answer specifics on that. So just to highlight that we may have to come back to people on that. There's a question for UK manufacturers who are exporting for CE marking, whether you're still able to self-certify. That will be dependent on the piece of EU regulation. And do please recognise that when it comes to EU regulation, since 2021, your obligations will have changed. You will certainly have new obligations as not being a participant in the single market. So it is always worth refreshing your understanding of your new obligations as a third country manufacturer supplying into the EU market. However, if there hasn't been a specific change, if there was a self-certification for that product, it is very likely that self-certification still exists. That is not a general rule, so it is worth going back to the original directives for which the requirement sits, and just understand as a third country manufacturer what your obligations are. Emily, if just one last question, because I think we have highlighted it already, but there's a question about placing goods on the Northern Ireland market. And I think a lot of the discussion that we've had having today, let's make it very clear that it's about the Great Britain market, the market of England, Wales and Scotland. There are separate requirements for Northern Ireland. They are governed by, amongst two pieces of legislation and agreements, the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework. That at the moment is in flux. So I think it's fair to say that a little bit of watch this space for goods being placed on the market in Northern Ireland. There are very different rules for that, so worth looking into. But today's conversation is more specifically about the placing on the GB market. Emily, if I can come back on CE marking and specifically on questions related to labelling and sticky labels. The first question: a lot of CE marked products currently have CE marks on labels. Has it always been a requirement to not have a sticky label, or is this something which has been ignored previously? a follow-on question to that on sticky labelling. Will UKCA marks and a sticky label still be accepted after 2027, or will it have to be moulded, engraved, or in some way permanently part of the product? If you could take those two questions, I think they're well related.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not actually sure on the first point. I'm not that familiar with the kind of CE rules, but I can talk about our kind of sticky labeling. So yeah, we often get kind of question of why can't we place markings by sticky label or on an accompanying document indefinitely. So we're allowing it to be placed on a sticky label or an accompanying document temporarily to provide more flexibility and make the transition to UKCA marking easier for businesses. And in some cases, this is already possible, as the regulations sometimes permit flexibility on where the marking is placed. So as I mentioned in the slides, please encourage businesses and encourage yourselves to check the specific regulations that apply to that good. And that might cover that first question. It might be that on a certain good, it's always been the case. I'm not sure. But we are continuing to consider the possibility of making our labelling easement permanent, and to hop on again about the roundtables, we really welcome feedback from industry on the value of doing this. So yeah, do just keep feeding us back your kind of specific challenges with UKCA, and we have been hearing a lot that labelling issue is quite a major one, so really encourage you to keep feeding back to us on that.
Emily, thank you very much for that. I will come back to you on one additional question vis-a-vis labelling and requirements, which I think is quite an important one on importing into the GB market. So when importing into the GB market a product that doesn't have a UKCA marking on it, what do firms do about attaining the correct technical documentation if the CE declaration of conformity doesn't align with UKCA requirements? So quite a technical one. I'm not sure if there's if we want to come back on that one, but just to say, Rohini, I'll come to you on another construction products question in a moment. Then maybe take one more from the floor, but in the interest of time, I think we might then wrap up. And if there are any unanswered questions, as I've said, we will work with colleagues to see if we can get written answers to you. Emily, over to you on the import of goods.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just looking, because I think I mentioned part of this in the presentation. I'll see if I can find that in a moment. So there seems to be a lot of kind of things in this question. I'm not completely sure on all of the kind of question, but I would say that the UK Declaration of Conformity is very similar to like the EU Declaration of Conformity. And also, just to kind of reiterate, at the moment, you can still continue to use the CE marking until 31st of December 2024. I don't know whether this question is related particularly to like the retesting easement potentially as well. So maybe I'll just find that line and then I can come in after Rohini with that one. That's great.
Rohini, this is a question I think which is probably a bit of a combination of questions. What is the guidance if we use construction products like insulation in our non-construction products? How would that work with UKCA marking out of the non-construction product by 2024?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I am not too sure to hand, to be honest with you on that question. But if it's okay, I will take that one away, and I will email you, Fergus, with a response. Colleagues who are dealing more specifically with insulated construction products. Sorry to not be more helpful now.
No problem at all. As I said, we will commit to come back into to people in written answer to the questions. Emily, Rachel, if I could come to you with another final question, a related question, but take the construction products out. So products which are supplied with batteries in situ, so in product, the batteries are CE marked. Will the batteries have to be UKCA marked by the deadline? And is there a separate requirement for that?
Rachel, are you happy to come in on this one? If not, I can take it. No problem.
I will leave that one for you, Emily.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
What we look into.
Sure. So I'm not actually sure whether there are specific regulations for batteries, which you can find in the A to Z of industry guidance, if there are. But generally, the general rule is if CE has been used on the batteries to demonstrate conformity, it will need a UKCA marking. And at the moment, the essential requirements and standards are mainly the same, but we would encourage you to check the specific regulations for that product to make sure that you're conforming with those. But generally, if you've been using a CE marking, you will need to use a UKCA marking by the end of 2024. And just coming back to the previous question on the declaration of conformity, because I found my lines on that. So yeah, you must keep documentation to show your product conforms to the regulatory requirements, and it may be requested at any time by market surveillance authorities. And the information that you must keep depends on the specific legislation which applies to your product and which economic operator you are in the supply chain. And this includes a technical file covering how the product is designed and manufactured, how the product has been shown to conform to the relevant requirements, the addresses of the manufacturer, and any storage facilities. And then a UK declaration of conformity should include a declaration the product conforms to the relevant requirements, has the name of and addresses of the manufacturer. A UK declaration of conformity is very similar to an EU declaration of conformity, but we strongly suggest you have separate certificates for both markets well in advance of the 31st of December 2024. And that other line that I had that I kind of mentioned in the presentation was where manufacturers are using the existing CE certification completed before the 31st of December 2024, we would encourage you to include a UK declaration of conformity, and in this, the list of relevant UK designated standards and equivalent EU harmonised standards that apply to the product, and the details of the EU CAB, which carried out the conformity assessment procedures. So do just get back in touch with us if you've got kind of further queries or want further clarification on that one.
Emily, thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for everyone who's joined us this afternoon. As I've said, we haven't had a chance to go through all of the questions, but thank you very much for those questions, really opening up that conversation. We will work with colleagues from government to answer the outstanding questions and send those through as part of the follow-up. What we will do is we'll have a general follow-up, and we'll come up with those questions probably after the initial follow-up and send those through to everyone rather than to individuals, as I think some of those questions were submitted anonymously. I will just double check with my colleague Annette if there's a final poll that we would like to run to understand the current the current feedback. I can see that has just gone live on my screen. If we could ask you to complete that, that would be fantastic. That just leaves me to yes, Annette.
Sorry to interrupt. Whilst we're doing the poll, can I just reiterate to delegates still on the call, because as you said, we are quite a few of the questions are posted anonymously. If you've posted a question and you don't think you've received the answer, drop me an email. I'll put that in the chat briefly that you've got them, but you also received those in the event communications so far. And then we can do our best to make sure that we are covering absolutely everything that was raised today as well. I have made a copy of all the questions, and I will share those with everyone on the panel in case you pick something up that's not been answered as well. So we hopefully covered everything.
Annette, thank you very much for that, and thank you for that additional clarification. While I see that people or participants are still filling in the post-presentation poll, thank you very much for doing so. Can I just take the opportunity to thank Emily, Rachel and Rohini for joining us today, for taking us through those very important changes and updates in terms of this policy area, and thank you for staying on and taking those questions. As I said, we will follow up with a copy of the presentation for participants, as well as a additional link to the roundtables, specifically the DBT roundtables, and I'm sure Rohini, when DLUC have further information on roundtables, we'll be happy to share that with participants as well. I did post the link to the roundtables in the chat for those who are still online. They can see that there, but rest assured we will follow up. So that finally leaves me to thank everyone who's joined us this afternoon. Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you at another Make UK session. Thank you.